and and Fabian will like this as well. So the best architecture project I've ever engaged in has actually been designing the environments that we have in what we call the dark level.
Mhm.
You never see them. You just interact with them through spatial sound. And I actually had a call yesterday with Barbara Tversky to discuss these things. And she was so excited about it. She's like, "Oh my God, Andrea, I wish I still had my lab." She doesn't have a lab anymore because I guess she's retired. But the kind of stuff that we are running into as we're exploring this, interaction and story in complete darkness is really crazy stuff. I don't know how much of that is actually going to make it into the game, because it just takes a lot of work to polish them.
Mhm.
But yeah, if you guys are interested in testing our game in about a few weeks, there's most of the action is in like just complete darkness.
That's really exciting.
Because basically the architecture, it's like I'm designing the spaces, like I'm actually drawing sketches, like architectural sketches of those spaces. So there's like a map and hallways and rooms, and things have a height and certain windows, and I'm designing materials. So it's a completely architectural process, but I'm designing how you discover those spaces as well, like how I'm designing the process through which you discover those properties. So first I'm designing the properties like a normal architect, and then I'm designing more like an interaction designer, level designer, how you would actually discover those properties, those material properties, given the fact that you don't have eyes. And then the space reconstructs in your head based on how you discover those properties. So you still end up, quote unquote, seeing the space I've just designed, but you'll never see it with your real eyes. I'm building it, I'm beaming it into your, I'm basically, our strategy from the start of the project was this thing, and I had to fight some battles internally to kind of be like, we are not showing anything, because the entire team from the beginning, the moment we stumbled into a lot of US issues, right? Like, I mean, who wants to be blind? Everyone was like, oh, let's just show something, kind of like Notes on Blindness is showing some visual clues in the environments. They're like, oh, let's just show some sparkle, or let's just, show a little color or something here. So, they have a better sense of direction. And I was like, no, there, you can't see anything. You cannot feed the visual cortex. The moment you feed the visual cortex, I won't go into the neuroscience of it, but the moment you feed a visual cortex, the whole processing in the brain changes. This is what I was discussing with Barbara Tversky yesterday. And we basically do not directly feed the visual cortex, but the visual cortex, we know, does come online when imagining things. So you get auditory information that then goes to the visual cortex to reconstruct the space. So you do end up with visuals in your head, just like when you read a book. So you do see my architecture, but not really with your eyes, which I find kind of, in a nerdy way, kind of interesting. I'm sure this is going to be the biggest flop ever. But
so
okay,
when
don't
you
record
say...
that, please. Let's
So
edit that out.
fair. When you say you do have a visual sense, or your mind builds a visual sense of it, do you mean, so this is something that I've been like, it's been a really interesting thing to sort of pick apart with a lot of folks, because I don't know if I've mentioned, or if you've heard, if it's come up before, but I have pretty much total aphantasia. So I don't have mental images. I don't see things in my head, but I do have like a superb sense of space. So something that I sort of think about a lot is the distinction between an understanding and a comprehension of a space and a picture of it, because we have all of these spatializations, these mechanisms for understanding, like we were talking about, and as you're sort of alluding to with the acoustics of a space and the ricocheting and other things like that, that there are ways that we generate spatial models, but it's not necessarily the case that it follows that it's visual, you know, and so I'm really interested in the extent to which people can get meaning out of drawing a distinction between visual and spatial. And you're absolutely right as well that visual information immediately crowds out and kind of dominates our understanding and our comprehension of what a space is. But as you say, like in the total absence of it, we still do have some sort of comprehension, some appreciation of space. But I'm curious about whether it's the right thing to do to call it visual. What do you think about that?
So my interest in cognitive neuroscience is very targeted at trying to understand exactly this, right? Like how what's the hierarchy in processing sensorial input, and it's pretty clear that the boss is the visual cortex, and the only thing that can challenge the visual cortex runs the show, and the only thing that ever challenges the visual cortex is the motor cortex. But everything else kind of falls in line with that. So I don't know, maybe you've heard me say this before, but the example that always comes to mind is when you have the impression that you heard something, you know, it's like I'm home and I was like, oh, did I hear someone in the living room, or did someone just come in, or did whatever, and is someone in my backyard, and I look out the window and there's no one there, and I'm like, oh, okay. So basically, I have the impression that something is happening in reality, which I don't understand. The visual cortex checks, and if the eye say no, there's no one there, then we consider that reliable information about reality. But if the opposite were to happen, we would not be behaving in a similar way. If I suddenly looked at my backyard and I saw my dead grandfather, I would go to the doctor. Like I would not use any other senses to check. It's like, you know, the boss running the show is usually the visual cortex. And the visual cortex tends to be the thing that checks the quote unquote truthness of that model of reality. And when you're cutting that off, first of all, well, the reason I was joking about our game not being a success is that it's really uncomfortable. You know, like people, you know, it doesn't feel good to just not see anything and all of a sudden have to be forced to understand a full story and characters and sounds and interaction and shit in the dark. It's like not cool. at least for a while. It doesn't feel great, but the brain has to keep going, right? It can't just stop. But if you stick with it, what that does is it just really forces this drastical change in hierarchy, where the visual cortex is forced to take the back seat and reconstruct rather than actively take information in. And I'm still trying to put my finger on, you know, how deep that how deep this whole reconfiguring of the hierarchy is. It feels profoundly different. It's something that sighted people like us obviously never experienced for very long periods of time. But it's not just like, oh, okay, I'm not seeing anything, I'm hearing this and it's coming from that direction. There's a way more profounder reconfiguration that just feels kind of otherworldly, but it's also scary how within maybe half an hour you are sailing smooth in there. Like basically it takes about half an hour for your brain to be like, I hate this, it's so uncomfortable, get me out of here, what the fuck is this, turn the lights on, to like being able to use the sound feedback to completely place yourself in the dark. It's like what you're saying, Brendel, if you get feedback of an object being somewhere in the dark, you have this like eerie sense of like, okay, that object must be about 5 feet from me in that direction. And that is placed there forever. It's very, very strange. Although, well, it's not, because you're in VR anyway, you're in the dark. But you have this eerie sense of, even now, there's this object that we have in one of the levels that's literally placed around about like 5-6 feet behind one of my monitors. Well, in VR, right? But that's kind of where I'm perceiving it when I'm in my chair. And even now, as I'm standing with you, I still have this eerie feel that that object right now is behind my desk monitor.
That's so
Like,
exciting.
it's very strange.
Yeah, that just bodes really well for some of the sort of tangibility is not the right word, but just like the concreteness, the potential concreteness benefits that we get from really leaning into broadening the scope of what virtual reality needs to entail, making sure that people know what needs to be sort of part of an all-encompassing experience, and what experiential impact comes from covering more of those bases with the different acoustic sort of characteristics of things and spaces and distances and reflections and stuff like that. So that's very exciting to hear. And I really look forward to playing your game whenever I get a chance to. I mean, if you do need to pare it back or change anything, then please make sure that you keep copies at these sort of levels of fidelity and refinement, and with this particular kind of point of view coming through, because even if it's ultimately not what you want to do for commercial or popular reasons, it's going to be really wonderful and interesting to have it around as a basic provocation about what it is that sound does when it's allowed to take center stage like this.
Yeah, I mean, I would love for you to test it, like all of you. And Brandel, if you have aphantasia, it would be mind blowing to interview you afterwards and to see exactly, you know, what and how you saw. But yeah, basically, since I always test the game sitting at my desk here in this particular location in my house, there's something in that different type of processing that makes me, I have this sense, just like what I said earlier, but it's not just about that object. It's like I feel the whole environment that, you know, I reconstructed through this audio is still here. It's like and I know this is like cuckoo kind of stuff, but this is starting to go into the conversation where, you know, I struggle to explain to people just how monumental this whole spatial computing thing is, and you know, I don't really get across. But and if I tell them examples like this one just now, people don't really understand. But right now I'm standing at my desk and I feel I am in two environments on top of each other. I'm in the environment which my eyes are seeing, which is my actual desk, my physical environment. But that game environment is so deep inside my head, because I guess we put it in some new location, right? We basically recorded it on some kind of disk that's new. So it feels right now that they're two on top of each other. Does that sound crazy?
No,
I'm not speaking metaphorically, which is the weird thing. I'm literally, it's like there's my office, which is getting processed in a certain part of my brain, and then there's this other thing. It's like I'm still in this because of course our game has a research facility. You never see it, but I am also, the research facility is also with me right now, and I know how wide it is, and I know where all the doors are. It's like all the stuff that you discover in the dark is still here in a weird way, and I think it's still here because we forced the brain to record it in a different part and in a different way. So they're on top of each other now. Yeah, anyhow, so I was running this by Barbara Tversky, and I was like, Barbara, help me make sense of this.
That's really fun. I mean, it's kind of a notional spatial palimpsest when you're kind of overriding the same space with different characteristics and functions, different sort of very subtle variances that fundamentally change what the space is for. And it would be really interesting to do that because, you know, living in a house, as we almost always do, the space sort of ends up being multi-encoded as being for different purposes, but it's still fundamentally pretty concrete. It's still the same things it is with the same dimensions. But when you have the ability to kind of overlay and change more intrinsic, sort of deeper features of the spaces that happen to be in the same place, I think there would probably be some pretty entertaining consequences for what that means that the spaces can kind of be and before. And yeah, it's interesting to think about. I mean, I think what you're describing of the sort of the overlay right now is potentially the worst is not the right word to put it, the way to put it, but the most acute that sense is going to be if it's not something that's ever recruited, it's not an effect that's ever exploited. And so there's a possibility, sorry, harassing my door, that if it becomes sort of a sort of persistently functional strategy, then we would naturalize ourselves to it. But it is really interesting sort of relishing those ambiguities and that sort of vibration sensorily at the time that it's first fresh. Brother is saying that he isn't going to be able to run things and wants us to start. Is that right?
Who's the boss here, or a coordinator, or is it Fabian or Andrea? Both. Okay, in unison.
All right, we can move into an overview of the day. Who will prototype?
There is no boss. We're all self-governed.
Yes.
We'll manage.
Yeah, we can do. So who's prototyping? I think Fabian and I are definitely prototyping.
I don't know. I skipped out on a rehearsal, so I have a bit more time now. But I have a gala dinner later this afternoon, so it will be yeah.
And maybe we go over the schedule quickly. Okay, so our coffee break is finished. And then the next half an hour we said would be talk about the goals and the rules. Okay, that sounds good. So that's until 10 o'clock. And then it looks like from 10 to 1, we break off and prototype offline on our own. And then we are back in the call at 1 after lunch to show everyone what we've done.
And just a little touch on this, because I think we mentioned it on Monday, but I did not consider it. I think that is, I mean, we can adjust, but I think that is valuable because we don't always want to see each other's face. But what was suggested Monday that I did not consider is we can still keep this room, for example, or another place open. And if people like the noise or want to just chat randomly, that could also be nice, and maybe not recorded at that point.
One thought that I had, not right now, but let me just run it by you to see. So for what I'm going to prototype, I'm going to use this in-house design tool that we have. And when we kind of play with the team, we started doing this thing which kind of works. So I don't know, let me see what you think. Maybe we could do that later as an exercise, that it's something we can all participate in. So I go in VR into the tool, and I like it's a bit out there. I like to play being an AI, and you prompt me. So you tell me what to build, and I build it. So that's one thing that's kind of fun. So you tell me, it's like, okay, put something there, make that thing yellow, build a tower, add a staircase, make a tunnel, and then I do it live, and I can do it fast enough. So it's like, yes, prompt an actual architect until we get the proper AI to do that. So I don't know, that's something fun that we could do, but that of course is not random, is related to some kind of scope, based on the text and the paragraph that we're working with. And then another thing that might be interesting, again, maybe not recorded, is for me to react live to one sentence or paragraph that you give me. I feel like I do my best work sometimes when I don't have to think about it. Like I'm like kind of forced to react on the spot to something. So for example, you give me 3 sentences, they can be from whatever kind of text. And then I go into my tool and I spatialize that live, like on the spot. And I kind of think out loud. So you see me live without any planning ahead of time, attempting or struggling to spatialize that sentence.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's always good when we indeed have external input so that we don't overfit to exactly what we think might be the problem, then we have good or bad surprises. So, but at what, because also Freud was asking in the chat about when, will it be then like right now for first quick one, and then you, based on that feedback, reiterate at 1:30 or something, or just after lunch? When would you prefer to do? Is it heavy to set up?
No, it's not heavy to set up. I'm not sure. I think I would prefer it a little bit later, so I have at least an hour to work on my own with the Moby Dick paragraph that I have, and then just kind of like just to warm up with getting into that mind frame, and then otherwise, if I start with the exercise where we do it together live, I might need 10 minutes or so to warm up and get it going. It's kind of like a weird combination of mental and physical exercise, to be honest. So that would be the most useful for me. We each decide, maybe I think it would be interesting to hear everyone share what they are planning on working on, so we have some anticipatory pleasure out of seeing what those projects might turn out. And then we go and work on our own, maybe keep this open or not, for at least an hour, and then we come back, we show people things, and then maybe I do a live exercise as well.
Yeah, sounds good. Also, because I see timings in the chat, we now it's the clarification of the goal. So now it's 9:39, according to the shared schedule. I mean.
So should we each go and say a brief description of what we plan on working on? And like Fabian said last time, I think it doesn't have to be any quote unquote prepared or serious kind of exercise. I think it just is just about playing together on a concept. So you know, you could just sketch something with a pencil, with the number 2 pencil for the next hour. That is right. That's relevant. So even that would count as prototyping work towards some kind of thing you want to figure out. So maybe when we say the few lines about what we plan on doing, maybe the goal should be to end that with a question, to like, you know, phrase what is your research project for the day? Like what question, like if today was the start of a little research project and you use prototyping in whatever form, what is the question that your research is trying to answer for today that has to do with text and immersive space?
Well, let's start then. I think I've been exploring how to spatialize text blocks or like break apart paragraphs into space. Today, I'm a bit more interested in breaking apart sentences. I don't think sentences are very linear when presented in the old style, but they don't reflect. They don't really reflect which parts, which words belong to which words, and like adverbs and adjectives could be tightly bound to the word they point to the word they actually belong to in a better way, to get rid of the commas, and also for lists. And many uses of the commas are for lists, and that could be spatialized, so we can see what the structure is at a glance. And I've been exploring that in 2D before, breaking apart sentences that way. And I'm interested in what that would look like in 3D. Another thing is what would happen if you replace some words with images as well, like in children's book. You could have instead of saying a red frog, you have a red frog inserted, like we use emoji sometimes, but also more. But that was just a side thing. Could we replace more abstract things with symbols, with colors, and but I don't think maybe that's a bit big to do in a couple of hours. But spatializing sentences, I'm very interested in that, so you can get a feel for it just by looking or so.
I think that's awesome. Oh, I think you can definitely prototype something that will start this. I love the children book idea. I think children books are really, really clever. And I feel like they're kind of the square one that we almost need to go back to when conceptually tackling these issues. Like go back to how we teach brains that are not fully developed yet to associate the world with words. Like that's the square one. So I love that idea. There's a book by Piaget called The Construction of Reality in the Child, which is really, really fascinating. That starts to look at some of that.
Yep,
Freud
and,
is saying something. Oh, discussion around the library. That's awesome. Distinction between search and browse in a library. That's awesome. Freud's research question: how can we provide access to our large documents in ways which are more useful than linear lists?
yeah, related to that, I'm very interested in what happens to text when you're around it, like an object, or when it gets bigger and it becomes more like a sculpture, which you can't really carry anymore. And then it becomes a room when it's around you instead of you around it. And the transition there, I know it's a scale and it can be everything at once, but how it changes our relation to text. Usually text in our ordinary lives is quite small and bounded, but we are also sometimes in museum exhibitions and inside, or we have text around us, or signs at streets and so on. I don't know where my thoughts are leading. I don't have a fixed notion yet or a theory of it, but how it changes. But it's interesting to explore that and yeah.
All right, who wants to? I have like a lot of stuff to say to that, but I feel like we should do that in the context of whatever prototype, because if I feel like, yeah, I don't know, I need to control myself today because I love these conceptual discussions so much, but I realize I can just talk for hours about it.
That would be really fun.
Don't worry, that's why we have the schedule. Is we have the goal and the schedule so that we don't just discuss all day about concepts. Because yeah,
Yes.
one of us would be eager to do that, but I don't think it's in.
It's kind of like we can have the cookies, but first we need to do some work.
Exactly.
I can talk a little bit about something that what Adam brought up made me think about, and something that it's been like I've done a bunch of little, sketches and prototypes, as some of you've seen, the visual syntactic text formatting and the perspective zooming and perspective scrolling and stuff like that. One of the things that I've been really taken by was James Holland's concept of context restoration and the enduring encoding of the practical consequences of reading. So when you read a book, at some level, all of the information is in it, and you kind of scan it word by word or paragraph by paragraph, however it is you sort of you process that stuff. And then, in the moment that you're doing the reading, like the actual reading act, you're in fairly tangible, direct contact with that information. But that contact is ephemeral, and you're left with your recollection of that reading as an increasingly sort of diffuse field or artifact or impact from it. And so it's not that it has had no contact with you by the time you finished the book. Obviously, you have that, but you don't have, and you can reread it, but what you don't have is your reading of the book. You don't have the actions and the steps. And something that I'm curious about is if we have the ability to either render, construct concrete artifacts of the reading that you did of your book. I feel like we have such acute experiential awareness of ourselves and our actions. Like the reason why it's so jarring and embarrassing to see yourself in video that you weren't intentionally kind of being part of. That if we had a way of being able to kind of really see our reading of it, and it might not just be you sitting in a room looking at it, or it might mean that it needs to be more than that in terms of being able to kind of, like if you were to read a book out yourself, then that's an artifact that you can record and then listen to and look at. But yeah, like one's own experience of a thing, being able to kind of refer back to that, I think is a really interesting thing to play with in a world where we can record everything and we can encode and we can save just so much data. Like what can we put that in service of that has been kind of beyond the pale as a consequence of this economy and parsimony of various computational resources. I've said before that I think that California is in many regards better at computing because Californians know how to be more wasteful than Europeans. And so as the sort of the onslaught of efficiency in the construction of these computing resources gives you more and more than Americans and Californians in particular are the best sort of positioned to be able to say, well, here's what I thought I would do if that incredibly expensive thing becomes cheap. So yeah, context restoration, the encoding of experiences specifically for kind of reflection and recall, whether that sort of creates itself an equally or more, maybe more meaningful artifact than the book itself as a mechanism for reflection and how one might be able to interact with it is something that I really want to play with, and I have yet to do enough with that I'm satisfied by what I've seen.
Should I go next? Oh, Fabian, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So last week I was offline, except for the call we had together, but otherwise the phone was off. I had my my little trusted Raspberry Pi Zero, which I now boosted with a 512 gigabyte micro SD card. Again, find that ridiculous with Wikipedia and Stack Overflow in it. And still most of it empty. So why I show this is because the goal today for me will be to, so what I did was connect this little device as a hotspot with this, the VR AR headset, with that, the Remarkable. So all these things, they do connect, but they don't necessarily work well together. And obviously they should, because the goal behind this, and that's the little sketch I was showing before, is to have a kind of unified workspace where I can actually like grab the thing, grab the document, but not just grab it in VR or AR, but also grab the same document, let's say with this, with the Remarkable, which has a completely different interface. So yeah, at some point I have to show an interface in the headset, which will have the same files as, let's say, the interface of the phone, and that if you modify one in the phone, you will see the changes in the headset and vice versa. And some of the challenge with that is beside the interface itself is, for example, the file format for this is specific to the device. Like it's a lines file, no other device reads it. The goal there is that each device provide at least one interoperable format, so that you're not stuck with it, basically, and it is properly that you can exchange data and modify it. I actually, for the purpose of this, well, I sketched on it some of the idea, and then Adam suggested a book before, and I do like Clark's work. So I added it during the chat, and also the visual that Adam generated a couple of weeks ago on an octopus with a bunch of different devices. This kind of symbol for the idea that you have those different devices, but they are not like one centralized thing. It's not the hotspot is not the center of it. You can have a mesh network, but each node has some form of intelligence. Of course, the Raspberry Pi or the VR headset doesn't have the same power as my desktop with a big GPU or as a cluster of GPUs, but it still should be intelligent enough to be able to communicate with the rest, basically. And that's a bit the challenge there, is how to make this work at all and then make it not cheating, let's say, by centralizing all the stuff on the desktop, because I don't think then you have a properly responsive setup. Voilà, that's about it. So I hope at one or so I'll show you some kind of interface that will work at least on 2 or 3 devices with 2 or 3 completely different ways to interact.
Are we brainstorming together here now, or are we just saying our projects first and then add things? Andrea and Fabian, you.
I think we're just trying to verbally express the gist of the concept we're going after. And then I would say we decide how long we want to work on it, and then come back, share where we are, and maybe that's when we have a first round of feedback. That's what would be most useful for me. So work a bit, share, get feedback, and then we do that again, like 2 cycles. Then work a bit more, maybe incorporate some of the feedback and the ideas, and then do the wrap up with the final feedback.
Yeah.
All right. So let me try to verbalize what I'm attempting to do. So I have written down like kind of four points that are related. Okay, so this might be overly complicated, but just bear with me. So the first thing I'm interested in is this thing I have in my head, this idea of looseness and tightness of a medium. I have to, if any of this rings a bell in terms of conceptual work already done on in this, even with these words, let me know, because I feel like I'm definitely not the first one to talk about this in this way. So this idea of the looseness and tightness of a sentence, for example, where at one end of the spectrum, you have stuff like poetry that is the maximum amount of like looseness, right? You have this like, the super abstract stuff with 2 letters in the middle of the page. So that completely opens up the field of interpretation. And the good poetry, which doesn't like completely do that, but it's the best poetry is very careful in how it opens up interpretation. It controls the way it opens up interpretation, because if you open up interpretation, but you don't control how you open it up, then it's like meaningless. And at the other end of the spectrum, I feel like we have academic writing, where the stated goal is to be as tight as possible in the relationship between text or communication medium, whatever that is, and the message. Actually, this is Marshall McLuhan. I should just revisit that again. So when it comes to what I plan on doing, which is taking this paragraph from Moby Dick and building an environment and a structure, a building out of that, That would fall for me more towards the poetry side of the spectrum, where you're gonna be like, I don't know, in some kind of room or some kind of building, and it's not gonna be that clear, right? It's like, what exactly is the relationship between that space that I'm creating and the sentence in Moby Dick? In my head, it would be a very close connection. So for me, there would be a lot of tightness, but maybe for you who might be going into that environment after me, it might not be. So what I'm proposing, spatializing meaning, has to fall within, I think, a conversation of looseness versus tightness between the medium of communication and the meaning. And I think this might be just a good conceptual framework for evaluating and looking at the success or failure of this spatialized environment that I'm proposing. Then the second thing is this idea I've been playing with in my head, and also in some calls I've had with Bob Horn. And actually, we've even implemented some of this in some of our work. This idea of the objecthood of abstract concepts. So, quote unquote, normally, or if we look at my preferred way of understanding language theory for natural languages, I like all the stuff that talk about embodiment and how embodied action in the environment has led to the development, or it is connected with a certain grammatical structure and syntax and prepositions and all of that. So I know there's arguments pro and con. That's just the kind of language theory that just vibes with me. So the whole thing in there is that you have certain experiences as an embodied creature, and then those experiences go and become cognitive actions that you use to then manipulate abstract concepts. And there's actually a lot of new research that is starting to back this up. There's more backing to this than we actually had in the 70s when these ideas first came out. So if you take all of the main categories of cognitive operations, you will see some similarities between them and how we navigate environments and deal with objects in the environment. So the arrow goes from embodied experience towards abstract concepts and abstract manipulation of concepts. What I'm interested in is in an arrow that goes the other way, in saying, here's an abstract concept, like, I don't know, I'll just go all the way abstract, but something like freedom or justice in a specific context, and giving that concept a object, a form with certain properties, and then trying to find out whether that process has opened up for you ways to manipulate that initial concept of, let's say, justice. So, okay, let me give you an example. I was doing this with Bob Horn, and he was working on some project, and there was this notion that his work was about conceptualizing this notion, and then we did this thought experiment where we said, okay, let's take this abstract notion and then say, okay, it is this metallic cylinder. Does this operation open up that notion to new particular actions? For example, this cylinder can roll. Can the notion of justice roll? Like, what does it mean? This particular object is cold. It feels cold and metallic when a human touches it. Is just is cold and metallic when a human touches it. And so on, right? So we did this exercise, and not all of those object properties open up new ideas about the abstract concept of justice, but a lot did. A lot did exactly that. A lot were like, oh, like just being forced to go through the exercise of being like, what would it mean? What would it mean that the concept of justice is cold to the touch to a human? So I'm interested in this. There was actually even the application that I'm going to use now. I was sharing that I think maybe a year ago on social media. We did this experiment with everyone thought was ridiculous, where we created this spatial menu where a digital file was represented in the form of this big ass 1 meter long capsule. And you would have to like load with this kind of 60s kind of weird thing. You would have to load your file into this holder and then physically move it. And when you had to delete it, you would have to like kind of clap this thing open, and this whole thing just like falls into the abyss. So we were forcing you to manipulate digital files as if they were like this heavy objects. And I won't go into, that experiment, but I think there is something to it. Then, okay, really briefly, the other thing is, once this association has been established between a concept and an object, does manipulating that object start to feel at any point like manipulating the concept? For example, if after talking to Bob for half an hour about how this bottle is actually the concept of justice, does me doing something new to the bottle start to affect in my head how I perceive the concept of justice? For example, it's empty right now because I drank all the water. Does me filling up this bottle start to add new ideas to how I think of the concept of justice? So the justice just got filled with fresh water. What does that mean? And the fourth thing that I'm interested in is just to, I feel like this is kind of clear, but it's still worth being stated, that I'm looking at the process that I'm going to attempt now. I'm referring to it in my head as a extraction process, where I'm basically extracting something from the paragraph as a particular medium of communication, and I'm translating it. But I like the word extraction better. And it goes without saying, of course, that the extraction process not only determines the kind of things that I'm extracting. If I didn't use virtual reality to extract and I use something else, I would be extracting other things. But also the extraction process itself completely changes what's being extracted. It completely kind of transforms it into something else. And this is all kind of already known stuff. I feel it's again the same as the written poem and singing the poem, or getting a novel and making it a Hollywood movie, right? It's that this going from one medium to another to open up new channels. It's kind of known and studied. But I do think doing that with VR as a medium of extraction brings up some fairly unique situations. All right, so this was like awfully conceptual and a lot, but I'm hoping after I get my scene going, we'll be able to revisit this, and hopefully they will seem less obtruse, or you'll help me clarify that based on the actual implementation that I'm gonna attempt.
Some of it made sense. Not everything to me, but that's I think the case for everyone. That's why we're here, to push with what ourselves even are comfortable with. So
Yes, that's the whole, I feel like, yes, exactly. That's for me, that's the whole concept of demo day, which we're going to validate today, right? Some person comes in front of you and says this shit, right? And most people, and I know this, like most people are like, what, Andrea? That sounds intelligent, but is it really? So that's the situation a lot of us are in with this kind of work. And today, we need to validate a different, better way of doing this, which is about putting, what's that expression? Putting your feet where your mouth is, and not just getting this theoretical crap out of you, but actually showing people something.
Yeah, no, I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, what you were saying about the way that the sort of the era of abstraction is sort of both sort of temporally and developmentally flows from the more concrete to the more abstract. But one of the things that happens with that is that we end up with these increasingly dangling signifiers as well. And we lose the relevance to the initial referent. And it can be to the point where people, you know, people's minds are absolutely blown when you bring up what it is that a dashboard is, or why we use all of these words about having a thin strip of material for film and visual, like animated visual media, having rewind and cue and all of those different things, loops, because they're in reference to the specific sort of substrate that they reside on. And so being able to kind of pull those things back and interrogate what different actions over these now increasingly abstract notions are is really powerful, because it lets you explore it, but it also lets you think about what you might be able to do in terms of applying actions, actually design a grammar and a lexicon of activity over those things. So rather than just like what it is that it means to you, it's like you can actually make it so that filling justice with fresh water is a specific semantic action within a new environment where we're, you know, like capable of constructing meaning around anything, any particular sort of set of elements and interactions between them. So like, and I think that moreover, that's what computing, what the interaction with increasingly elaborately mediated media will be. You know, I hesitate to even call it VR or with computers or any of those things, because that's not the point. The point is that what it is that we're doing with things is going to get to a point where it doesn't need to be pragmatically motivated insofar as, you know, you put pen to paper because I think you can't write when it's not on the paper, but what does it mean when you can write off the paper, and why would you do that, and what significance would it have to other people around you that you wrote but not on the paper? You know, so I really like that as an invitation and as a provocation for making new metaphors to live by.